Hey people, how are you doing today? It's Makeda Valletta, and I'm sitting here with my dad, Plathel Benjamin, who is a former history professor, former journalist. Since I, have been alive, he has been a freelance journalist writing about all types of things. But he was heavily involved in the movement, and there's so many things for me to say about him, but he's had a great influence on the woman that I am. Okay, and just how he raised me, and I grew up around black scholars. I grew up around freedom fighters. My dad always taught me to do research and read and back up what I'm saying and have facts and think critically and believe what makes sense to me, and always stressed as well that not thinking that because I'm a woman that I can't do something. So my entire life he was always pointing out powerful women to me, and black and other races as well. And so I always say that he's the first feminist I've ever met, even though, a lot of times people think of feminism as this dirty word, but there's all types of feminists, and who don't all agree with each other. But for me, at the very basic level, it's just that a lot of the black men that I've seen who are in my age range, maybe slightly older, younger, who are very pro-black, they're also very machismo. And they have a lot of ignorant ideas when it comes to women. And my dad always warned me about those type of men. And he is always, just like, Barack Obama, having no problem admitting and speaking about his female teachers. And so today we're going to talk in depth. We've done other conversations, so if you haven't seen previous conversations that we've done, you can check it out. I started a YouTube page for our conversations because we're going to have many conversations about many topics, both black history, and when I say black history, not just black Americans, but also we can talk about the Caribbean, we could talk about Africa, but also worldly stuff as well. So not just that, but it is Black History Month, and today I want to have a conversation with him about his mentor, a woman named Queen Mother Moore, who I feel like a lot of people don't know about, because I feel like if it wasn't for my dad, I don't know if I would know about her, because in my studies and classes, I don't remember her being brought up. And they're very, powerful stories that I've heard over the years of him talking about her. So today we're going to go more in depth with that. And so, welcome, Dad.
Let me say this. Everybody who was in the radical movement in the 1960s, 1950s know who Queen Mother Moore is. But as Makeda said, is not a lot about her, in the scholarly literature. However, that's being remedied because there's a young Harvard-trained historian who is working with Dr. Ashley Farmer. She's a professor of black women's intellectual history at the University of Texas. I think it's the University of Texas at Austin. And she is working on a full-length scholarly biography of Queen Mother Moore right now. And it should be out within the next year or so. And she's doing a thorough job. I've been in touch with her. I've had many conversations with her. And she's doing a great job. And this book will tell you just about everything you need to know. Now, Gerald Horne, Dr. Gerald Horne, the preeminent American historian, I think Gerald Horne is, I think he's the most broadly learned, prolific historian writing in America today. And I say that based upon, the fact that he's published around 40 books, and he is, the range of topics that he deals with, no historian in America can match the range of his intellectual range. And he wrote about Queen Mother in his book on Benjamin Davis, the communist councilman from Harlem, who served 2 terms in New York City Council, running on the Communist Party ticket. And Queen Mother was his campaign manager, as I mentioned in a previous discussion. And Gerald Horne writes about her in this book. But and it's funny because he's also a professor in Texas at the University of Houston. But Dr. Farmer.
Who, Dr. Horne?
Yeah. But Dr. Farmer, her book will be out in, I guess, another year or so. But there were three people. What we were talking about is how I became, a radical, how I became a revolutionary. Queen Mother played the most important role in that, in that development. However, there were three people. Actually, there were five, because I developed in Philadelphia. This is where, I was introduced to radical politics and where I developed, my conception, the world, and began my life as a public intellectual. There were three people. There was Judge Joe Rainey, who produced and hosted a show called The Listening Post in Philadelphia. It was a forerunner of progressive talk radio. And it was on a commercial radio station, interestingly enough, and it came on for 3 hours, during the week. And it was at night. It came on like from, I think it started like around, 10 o'clock at night or something, and ran to like 1 in the morning or something like that. But it began with him, because he's the one that put me on the radio, and we ended up creating a position of radio historian. I used to come on and do an hour lecture, a serious lecture, historical lecture, and then take 2 hours of questions and answers. So it was Judge Joe Rainey who began it all, because he put me on the radio. I was just, an obscure young guy studying, been studying for a couple of years, just studying, black history, going through, beginning with the work of the 10 volumes of J. Rogers. I explained it in previous discussion. But anyway, he's the one that put me on the air, and it was through him and that first radio program, May 25th, 1962, on my 20th birthday, that I met Queen Mother. She was listening, and she called up and I got to know her. She invited me to come to her house and talk to her, and she had this, when I met her, she'd already been in the movement over 40 years. She started in the Garvey movement, back in the 20s. But it was Queen Mother, it was Judge Joe Rainey, Queen Mother Moore, and the Reverend Dr. Leon Sullivan. They played critical roles in my life. Now, Rainey and Sullivan were not revolutionaries, but they made it possible for me they gave me a public platform. Joe Rainey gave me a public platform in the Philadelphia area, because this was a 55,000 watt station, and so this signal went to southern New Jersey, northern Delaware, and Philadelphia, so like places like Wilmington, Delaware, Camden, New Jersey, Trenton, all the way up to Morristown, Morristown, Pennsylvania. So it was a considerable area of this broadcast. So he gave me a voice in that whole area. And Leon Sullivan would later give me a national platform, which I will talk about later when we get to, but it was Judge Rainey, Queen Mother Moore, and Reverend Leon Sullivan. And there were two other people that would play a role. Bill Crawford, who owned a bookstore called the New World Book Fair. This bookstore it seemed like every book on revolution in the modern world. It was a store that specialized in revolutionary literature, and it was located right near the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. Long before bookstores had, like here, there used to be a bookstore right down in Columbus Circle. Now bookstores are going out of existence as a result of Amazon. But this was one of the, with Barnes & Noble, yeah. They had a big bookstore there that had a coffee shop in it, and you could go in and browse the books and sit and have coffee and have conversations with people. Well, Bill Crawford's bookstore was like that years before. This was in the early 60s. And it was in this bookstore that I met revolutionary intellectuals from all over the world who were attending the University of Pennsylvania, and I got an education in that bookstore, which was, it was superior to political educations I would have gotten probably in any college at that time. Now, of course, Queen Mother had introduced me to Bill Crawford, because they had known each other as comrades in the old left, in the Communist Party, and he would let me use his bookstore as if it were my personal lending library. I could go there and get any book I wanted and take it out. And of course, I would talk about the bookstore on my radio, because I became a. What happened was Mr. Rainey put me on May 25th, 1942. The program was such a sensation. He ended up making me a regular. Like for almost 4 years, I was on there every other week doing an hour lecture and taking 3 hours of questions. And that's how I first became a public intellectual. That's how I first developed a public audience. And it was from this program and Queen Mother introducing me to Bill Crawford. And he just like basically, as I said, turned his bookstore over to me. I was able to take any book I wanted. And then there was another bookstore, Hakeem's Book Mart. Now Hakeem was a certified public accountant, but he was a race man. You know, he was an Ahmadiyya Muslim. There was a strong Ahmadiyya Muslim movement in Philadelphia. Excuse me, Ahmadiyya is the Muslim sect that included black jazz musicians like Ahmad Jamal, like Yusef Lateef, like Shaheed Shahar, you know, the great baritone player. All of those were, even McCoy Tanner. McCoy Tanner's name was Saud Suleiman. Most people didn't know that. But all of these jazz musicians with Muslim names, most of them were Ahmadiyyas. And so Hakeem was. And he kept this bookstore as a public service to the black community. It was called Hakeem's Book Mart. And Hakeem seemed to have every book published about black people, and Bill Crawford had every book published about revolution. And of course, in Bill Crawford's store, a lot of them were about, you know, black revolutionary movements, as well as Hakeem had some about black revolutionaries, obviously. And between these two bookstores, you know, I had this tremendous personal library. Both of them let me just come in and take any book I wanted, you know, and they were like, so it was in the black community of Philadelphia that I got my education, you know, about the world, you know, and see, I often hear people talk about, you know, black people don't cooperate. No, I am a pure product, you know, of the black community. I went to segregated schools in Florida. I never had a white teacher. Every teacher I had coming up was black. I went to Florida A&M University. They were all black. Now, I took some courses at Temple doing later on, you know, as I began to develop this public audience. I took some 2 or 3 graduate courses at Temple, but they were evening courses. So I didn't have to show that I had an undergraduate degree because I wasn't matriculating. I was just paying for taking the courses. And they were a course in anthropology, sociology, and economics, because I had begun to read the scholarly literature in these fields, and I didn't really understand a lot of the terminology. So I took these courses so I could learn more about the terminology and methods of the discipline. That's why I took them, so I could read the scholarly literature. But basically, I'm an autodidact, you know, that's to say, self-educated, you know, like Frederick Douglass, you know, or like Harold Cruz, you know, one of the great theoretical thinkers of the 20th century. And of course, Harold Cruz would eventually become, you know, a mentor of mine. But all of the people who contributed to my intellectual development were black folk. And they all reached out and helped me in various ways. By the time I had got my first white teacher, a white mentor, Ted Hirschberg, at the University of Pennsylvania, and the great anthropologist at the University of Minnesota, who was a world-renowned authority on mass transformative movements. You know, and these are the people who introduced me to, you know, thinking of history in terms of in a theoretical sense, in terms of classes of phenomena and whatnot, where you could begin to look at things, you know, as rather than just as a discrete event, the way historians were inclined to do. I could look at them, like for instance, in the case of and it's funny because I have at the moment I can't recall the name, but I am 80 years old, you know, but I rarely forget anything, you know, and right now I'm trying to remember the name of the anthropologist. It will come to me who did this. But in any case, I had it wasn't until I was, you know, quite well developed. That probably was around, you know, 4 years later or so before I began to get any white teachers, any white mentors, you know, who began to instruct me. And when I did, they were really, really first class people. Now, Queen Mother was my first important teacher in radical politics. Queen Mother, like I said, when I met her, she had been in the movement for 40-something years. She started in the Garvey movement. She was living in New Orleans when Marcus Garvey came to speak. Now, if you don't know who Marcus Garvey is, Marcus Garvey was the leader of one of the greatest mass movements of the 20th century among black folk. It was a nationalist movement. One of its objectives was to resettle Afro-Americans in Africa. Garvey was a Jamaican. He was a Jamaican immigrant, and the Garvey movement is probably, before the Civil Rights Movement was the largest mass movement, but Garvey's movement as an organization, it was the largest mass organization. And Queen Mother, even though she was a Creole, a mixed blood, very high, very light skinned, and in New Orleans, a lot of the Creoles didn't really want to think of themselves as black. And that's because of the French system of the way in which the French color caste system worked. They had a triple system. They had whites, blacks, and mulattoes, or people they call Creoles, the gens de couleur, they call them, the gentlemen of color, the educated mixed blood, the educated mulatto. This is, and these people, under the French, they had a separate status, a legally recognized status. Now, when they became a part of the United States, the Anglo-Saxons refused to make this distinction. We see it finally, the opinion of the attitude of the Anglo-Saxons on this question in the Dred Scott decision of 1896. Homer Plessy, who, in the case of Plessy, not Dred Scott, I'm sorry, Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Dred Scott was waived in 1857 and was about something completely different. I meant the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the decision that we think of as the separate but equal decision, because this is the decision that made segregation legal. But there was another part of the Dred Scott decision, and that had to do with Homer Plessy, who argued in his case not only that trying to segregate him, it had to do with him taking a train trip from Plaquemine to Hermitage, Louisiana, and they wanted to put him in what later became known as Jim Crow. They wanted to put him in a special black section. And his argument was, first of all, that kind of racial segregation was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which it clearly was. But he also argued that even if you could justify segregating black people, that he should not be segregated because he was not really black. He said, I'm an octoroon, I'm 7/8 white. The Supreme Court didn't even consider his claim, and we ended up with this business about the one drop rule, like what it amounted to, if you have any evidence of African ancestry, you were black. That's what it amounted to, and so they refused to make this kind of distinction, but it lived on in the Creole community of New Orleans and elsewhere. And Queen Mother, even though she grew up in that, she rejected it. And she went to this Garvey. Garvey came to New Orleans to speak, and she went to the meeting. The sheriff showed up to try to break up the meeting, but in Louisiana, black people have a long tradition of carrying guns. And everybody had their guns, and they began to shoot up in the sky and said, "Let Garvey speak." They started chanting, "Let Garvey speak," and firing their guns. And the sheriff hightailed it out of there, And Queen Mother was very, very impressed by that. She was so impressed by it that she left New Orleans and came to Harlem just to join the Garvey movement. And she came to New York to Harlem, and this began her life of activism. She started in the Garvey movement.
So I have a question. How did she get in Philly? When you met her, she was in Philly?
She was in Philadelphia, yeah, but that was many, many years later.
So she came to Harlem and then she went to Philly?
Yeah, she moved to Philadelphia later,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. But the thing is that, so she came to Harlem, she joined the Garvey movement, and she was in the Garvey movement for years, And when the Garvey movement, petered out, to the end of the 20s, she was sitting on her stoop in Harlem when the Great Depression hit, 1929, when the Depression hit, and the Depression began to spread. They would come and evict people from their apartments. But then Queen Mother noticed one day that when they would evict people, there was this group that would show up, a white and black group, together, and they would, as soon as the marshal would put their belongings on the sidewalk, this group would show up and go put them right back in the apartment. And so she thought, who are these people? Who are these white people, that are up here, in Harlem, fighting for blacks like this. And then with the Scottsboro boys, the 9 boys and Scottsboro boys, that they sentenced to death because they were hobos on a train, and they ended up they were in a freight car with some white women. They didn't even know they were women.
I never even heard about this. What is this?
The Scottsboro case. The Scottsboro case was in Scottsboro, Alabama. This was, during the Depression. Mm-hmm. A lot of people were, like they say, riding the rails. They were mm-hmm. hobos. And these guys were black guys, they were in this freight car, just hopping a train. Mm-hmm. And in the other end of it, there were some white women in there. They didn't even know that they were women, And when they stopped, they would stop these trains at various places. They would just search the cars to see if there were hobos on them. And they caught them in the car with these white women. And they ended up accusing them of rape, and sentencing them to death. Mm. Now, the Communist Party, both the NAACP, the NAACP fought this case, but so did the Communist Party. The Communist Party had set up a group called the International Labor Defense. And Conrad Lynn, the great lawyer from here, same one who later defended Lolita LeBron after they shot up the Congress. Great lawyers of the 20th century, radical black lawyers. He defended the Scottsboro boys, ended up saving their life. But in any case, the Scottsboro boys became an international issue. The communists were one of the ones who made it an international issue because the United States was everywhere talking about how America stands for equal rights for everybody. So all these racial incidents, they would blow them up, around the world. Now, Queen Mother, she was sitting on her stoop, and she saw this march and this demonstration coming down the street, free the Scottsboro boys, free the Scottsboro boys, and she's sitting there, and she saw this blonde white woman with this sign, free the Scottsboro boys, and she thought, I'm the one that should be carrying this sign. So she jumped in the demonstration, took the sign from the woman, and she started carrying it, and that's when she didn't know who they were. That's when she discovered that they were communists. That these white people she had seen coming up here, putting people's furniture back in and leading the fight for the Scottsboro boys, she saw that they were communists, And so her thing was, if they for me, I'm for them, And she ended up joining the Communist Party. Now, Queen Mother, one of the things she taught me about, and she used this event to teach me about, was the nature of alliances. She explained to me that, well, first of all, when I met Queen Mother, she was a black nationalist, but she was a revolutionary nationalist, and she explained the difference between bourgeois nationalism and revolutionary nationalism, but I'll talk about that in a moment. First, in the discussion of alliances, she told me that a lot of young people in the movement were making race a fetish. They were beginning to fetishize race and making race the be-all and end-all of everything. She told me, look, that there are whites with whom we could form alliances. There were whites who were interested in some of the same things that we were interested in. It didn't matter that they were not interested in everything we were interested in, because that's what alliances are. The reason you have alliances is because there's some things you agree on and some things you don't. However, she explained it to me this way. She said, suppose we're trying to get to point D. And here's a group of people who are just trying to get to point B. So we form an alliance with them and get to point B. When we get to point B, we find another group of people who's interested in getting to point C. So we form an alliance with them and get to point C. Until we find a group who's trying to get to point D, and then we form an alliance, and that's how you form an alliances. She told me we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. She's the one who taught me these lessons. She told me, and she said, she told me that I needed to understand that, like, take the white working class, for instance. she explained to me that the white working class were objectively allies with us because we were all oppressed, by, the capitalist system, and that the white working class had as much interest in wanting to see socialism in America and as we did. And the difference, she made a distinction between bourgeois nationalism and revolutionary nationalism. If you were not interested in revolutionizing society, if you were not interested in creating a new order, if you were not interested in getting rid of capitalism and forming a socialist society, then you were reactionary. You weren't a revolutionary. You were a bourgeois nationalist. You were only interested in race, in racial mysticism. She used to call them damn fool nationalists. That's what she used to call them, and as opposed to revolutionary nationalists, which she was. You understand what I'm saying? Now, she was a critic of both Orthodox Marxists and purely racial nationalists. She had told me that Marx, saw a lot of things that we needed to know, but he didn't see everything. That we had problems that Marx, never dreamed of. And therefore, that's where we had to be the leading theoreticians on this question. We had to define what race meant. Like, for instance, one of the things that attracted her to the Communist Party and attracted a whole generation of brilliant radical blacks to the Communist Party was the Communist Party's position on what they called the national question. Okay? The national question was this. It was a definition of who we are. Their position, the national question, said that Afro-Americans were a captive nation, that we were an oppressed nation, and that our land, the land of this nation, was the former states of the Confederacy. That we worked this land, we worked it for centuries without pay, and it belonged to us. That it was more ours than anybody, that Afro-American culture formed in this land, and so the Communist Party's position was this was a Negro nation. And so many of the blacks who had joined the Communist Party, in the 20s and 30s, joined around this Negro nation thesis. And many of the people that I would meet had left the party when the party abandoned this position. And of course, they abandoned it because it was based upon Joseph Stalin's treatise on the national question. And in 1956, when the Soviet Party overthrew, eradicated Stalinism in the party, they rejected his position on the national question, and the American Party also rejected. So they dropped the Negro nation thesis, and a lot of black communists left the party. And these were people that I met. But these were people who were committed to the liberation of black people, and they saw our oppression as being a part and parcel of American capitalism. Slavery was a product of American capitalism. The peonage of black people in the South, that is, the whole sharecropping system, which was now you see people refer to it as neo-slavery. That was a part of the capitalist system. When Malcolm X, for instance, in the 1960s, Malcolm X was talking about taking the problem of the black people to the United Nations, and raise out. He was saying, rather than civil rights, we need to go to the United Nations and declare our situation a human rights problem, and ask and petition the United Nations to deal with it. Now, as Gerald Horne points out, and Gerald Horne is the principal historian of the Black Left. He has done more work in reconstructing, constructing, and writing the history of the Black Left than anyone. And as he points out, that the reason that people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King rose to prominence in the 60s is because the government had basically destroyed the radical black leadership of the 1950s, who were mostly communists. People like Paul Robeson, people like W.E. Du Bois, people like Ben Davis, and people like William L. Patterson, whom I want to speak to here. When people thought that this was a novel idea when Malcolm X was talking about taking a case to the United Nations, but Malcolm X had a very undeveloped idea about this. It was really sophomoric, his notion of how to do this. This had already been done. This had been done in 1951 in a book-length petition titled "We Charge Genocide." The editor of this was William L. Patterson, and he was a radical lawyer. He lived here in Harlem, lived right in 409 down the street. He was a communist, and he edited this, and some of the leading intellectuals and reporters and what have you of the time worked on it. W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, all of them worked on it. And this was submitted to the United Nations. It's called "We Charge Genocide, the Crime of U.S. Government Against the Negro People." This thing is, this is a richly detailed, like I said, book-length indictment that covers a 5-year period, of United States government treatment of Black Americans. He looked intensely at this period. The evidence is irrefutable. The evidence, a lot of it was based upon reporting in the leading news organizations and what have you, but you can buy it. You can buy it online. Just go to Google, "We Charge Genocide," William L. Patterson. You should read it. You should read it. And you'll see how ridiculous and hypocritical it is when the United States, for instance, accused the Chinese of committing genocide against the Uyghurs. Compared to how they treat the niggers, the Uyghurs is on a holiday. You understand what I'm saying? What the Chinese, what their policy toward the Uyghurs is lightweight stuff compared to U.S. government policy toward the niggers. All right, and you should look this up. Again, as I say to people, there's no royal road to knowledge. If you really want to understand these things, you've got to do some research. However, Dr. Gerald Horne has written a book on William L. Patterson. The title of it is Black Revolutionary. If you look on YouTube, and you will probably be able to find a video of Dr. Gerald Horne talking about William L. Patterson. So you should Google that, Dr. Gerald Horne on William L. Patterson. But Queen Mother Moore introduced me to luminaries among the Black nationalists, leadership, and among the communist, theorists. She introduced me to William L. Patterson. And by the time I met William L. Patterson, she had given me the book, and I had read it. And when I met him, I felt like genuflecting. I felt like bowing, you understand what I'm saying? Because they had done such a great job of documenting, the genocidal treatment of Black people in this country as a matter of U.S. government policy. Now, they were able to dismiss this, largely because Patterson was a communist, and because people who worked on it were communists. However, that's another part of our history that is the same way that Black history is suppressed and whatnot. The history of the American left, has been largely suppressed. If you look, like Queen Mother, another thing she taught me about was what she called the relationship of forces in the world. That is, how do nations relate to each other? What are the alliances, the power blocks? Which nations are allies, which are adversaries, what have you? What is the relationship of forces in the world? I learned that the United States and the so-called democracies were the ones who were the countries that colonized Africa. They were the ones who supported the white fascist regimes in Southern Africa and South Africa and what was then Northern and Southern Rhodesia and Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. They were the ones, the principal supporters of the European colonial powers, who were England and France, were the largest, and America's closest allies, and then supporting these white, as I say, fascist regimes in the South, who were allied with the Africans. Who was supporting the African liberation movement? The communists were. This is why the Cold War played such an important role. The Cold War, I didn't understand much about it before I met Queen Mother. I met her right after I came out of the Strategic Air Command. When I met her, I thought the communists were the devil, period. I had just come out of an organization, the Strategic Air Command, a nuclear strike force, whose mission was the nuclear destruction of the Soviet Union. You know, something that appeared to me to be quite, understandable. It's not. I thought nuclear weapons, period, were crazy. But I thought if anybody deserved, to be nuclear bombed, it was the communists, right? So when Queen Mother told me that she had been a communist, I was shocked, beyond belief, until she started telling me why she joined the Communist Party and the kind of work that they did. For instance, the integration of American baseball. Baseball was called the national pastime, but black athletes were barred from baseball. The people who led the fight above all the white folks who were on the cutting edge of leading the fight to integrate baseball was the Communist Party. The Daily Worker, which was the Communist Party newspaper, the sports editor at the Daily Worker, if you look at their articles and compare them to whatever was being said in the New York Times, any other, they were by far, the most vigorous advocates for ending the color bar in baseball. Now, Queen Mother was involved in that struggle. And this is one of the things that she told me that she deeply regretted, her fight to integrate baseball. And the reason is that it resulted in the destruction of the Negro Leagues. And she was a big fan of the Negro League games, and this was something black people had. If you go and look up pictures, like my son has been working, on a book on blacks in baseball, and I have learned a lot about the Negro Leagues and whatnot from his research. And you look at these, this was a big deal in black life, the Negro Leagues. You look at, black people used to fill up stadiums, and you see them, they were all dressed in their Sunday go to meeting clothes. I mean, they were dressed to kill, And one of the reasons they were dressed to kill is because the baseball players were fashion icons. They were among the best dressed people in the country, the black baseball players. I mean, you look at Jackie Robinson, look at pictures of him, how sharp he was all the time. Willie Mays, all of them. The black baseball players were big stars. They were fashion icons, and the Negro League games were a big deal in the black community, and they had their own style of play. They had all kinds of trick plays and comedic antics and whatnot, which obscured the fact, like the Harlem Globetrotters, which caused some people to think that they weren't really great baseball players, but when they got a chance to play in the major leagues, they came in and dominated. Jackie Robinson came in. They'd never seen anything like Jackie Robinson.
And it was one interesting, and also the Harlem Globetrotters started in Chicago, which I learned.
It did, yeah.
But one of the things, like when you mentioned with Queen Mother, seeing the white people marching down the street in New York, protesting for black people, was interesting because, growing up in New York City, I grew up around white people who were like that. But not only that, like, you always had white friends, but you were also like a fiercely pro-black man. And then when you took me to Florida when I was 12 years old, and you were telling me about, what it was like growing up in the segregated South, and it made me cry because I was like, to me it sounded horrible. With me being from New York, where to me in my world everybody got along, it was super diverse, and so I couldn't imagine that. And I said to you, Dad, how could you have white friends, right? Because the stuff that you were telling me about, I'm like, how could you have white friends? And you said to me, well, to me, all white people are guilty till proven innocent, but they're not all bad. There's white people who risked their lives during the movement, fighting. And then there are black people who didn't do anything. So you can't just, there are black people who think like white people can't be allies, And that's one of the things that, and my assessment could be wrong, but my assessment of living in Chicago, for example, and I respect the pro-blackness in Chicago. But I feel like the mindset there amongst the pro-black people is like just black people. White people are kind of like the enemy. We don't want them to help us, type thing. Whereas I feel like in New York, people have more of a progressive mindset about that.
Well, let me say this.
Mm-hmm.
The two greatest movements that propelled the progress of black people in this country is the abolitionist movement of the 19th century that eradicated slavery, abolished chattel slavery, and the civil rights movement of the 20th century, which destroyed the legal racial caste system. People can talk about whatever they want about who done what, but I grew up under segregation. And for people who say that nothing has changed, they have no idea what they're talking about at all right? Now, DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, where I grew up, is an asshole, you know, and Florida has moved from a crack of rednecks to the Cuban rejects, as I say. But things in Florida now are not nearly as bad as they were when I was coming up, you know. And black people in Florida have, you know, power in a lot of different places. And they're mayors of towns, law enforcement people. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager in Florida, a black cop couldn't arrest a white person. If they saw a white person committing a crime, they had to call the police. They had to call the real police. They had to call the white police to come and arrest them.
Oh,
you
wow.
understand what I'm saying? So things have, a lot has changed, but there's a lot that remains to be done. But the thing is that both the abolitionist movement of the 19th century and the civil rights movement of the 20th century would not have been possible without white allies. There were many white abolitionists, you know, and there were many white people who participated in the civil rights movement, who died in the civil rights movement, who put their lives on the line, you know, who went down there when a lot of so-called militants was up here in the north talking tough. You know, they went down and put their life on the line.
And that's another point.
Died, you know?
That's another point that I want you to touch on too, about the difference between the North and the South, because there's a lot of people who try to say, "Oh, the North is just as bad, it's just as racist." And I remember, like, my mom is from Western Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania is full of Klan, but it still was not as bad as the segregated South. And when you would talk about that, like how it was a different beast, and even with Malcolm, you know, not being in the South and the difference that was, even though, you know, you had racism in the North, but it wasn't as nasty as it was in the South.
Man, let me tell you something. Malcolm X used to like, at one point, he used to like to call Jackie Robinson Uncle Tom. But you can see pictures of Jackie Robinson marching with black folk on the front line in my hometown in St. Augustine. I was a partisan of Malcolm X during the 1960s, but when I went back to Florida, I left Florida in the summer of 1960. I didn't go back again until Easter weekend 1988. I stayed away almost 30 years. But when I went back, and well, a friend of mine, Steve Oates, who I delivered a tribute to just recently at the University of Massachusetts, the history department presented a tribute to him. My presentation can be seen on C-SPAN Book World. Just put my name in, go to C-SPAN Book World and put my name in, and you will see my presentation on Stephen Oates. And also you will see a presentation of mine, a lecture on Dr. W.B. Du Bois, after I had written a book on him in 2003. Me and Stanley Crouch, you can see my lecture here and the question and answer period, and you will learn a lot about W.B. Du Bois, the most important black intellectual of the 20th century. In any case, in this talk about Stephen Oates, I mentioned the fact that he had written graphically about the struggle in St. Augustine, because Oates wrote a book on Martin Luther King called Let the Trumpet Sound. And in this book, he details King's St. Augustine campaign, which was critical. It's critical for several reasons. One of the reasons it was critical is because it took place in the summer before the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and had a lot to do as a catalyst with getting the Omnibus Civil Rights Bill of 1964 passed, which outlawed legal segregation in the South. It's a very, very, very important body of legislation, that 1964 Omnibus Civil Rights Bill. So in Oates' book, if you would read, you know, Let the Trumpet Sound, and you read that section, he details, you know, these marches, these night marches that they were conducting. When I read about them in his book, I remember when they were happening, and I had seen them on the news, but in his book, he details what happened. I'm sitting there reading this, and I'm thinking, when I look at the route that they took, you know, they left from St. Mary's Church over in Lincolnville. Lincolnville was the black section of St. Augustine, and they marched downtown to the old slave market. Well, the thing is this. This is a route where there's like endless places, dark, places they pass by, very heavily, places with trees and darkened spots, where you could hide, a sniper could hide and fire, on the possession. And I wondered, and I'm looking at the people who were involved in it. And these were people that I knew, who were, when I left there, just quite ordinary people. And they're doing things that are heroic. When I went down there, I went to the archives and I was reading through the accounts of the period. And I was just amazed at what some of my neighbors and what they had done. So I decided to interview them myself. I decided to interview some of them, and ask them, where did y'all get the balls to do this? And I remember, Haywood Fleming, was one of the ones who was at, and Jimmy Jackson. And they told me, they said, look, before we went on these marches, Dr. King would preach. He said it was a lot of great singing, and Dr. King and Andrew Young and them, would speak. And they said, we began to feel that God was on our side, They said, but even so, Haywood told me, say, the first march, even after all the singing and King and all them, they wasn't sure they wanted to go marching down there because Hoss Manussi, the local redneck leader, they had an organization called the Ancient City Gun Club, where these crackers were all armed to the teeth, and they knew that they were hovering around down there and whatnot, and so they said, we didn't know, whether we wanted to go walking into that. They were still sitting in the church when they were lining up outside. And then they say somebody came running in the church and said, guess what? Jackie Robinson is here. Jackie Robinson is going to march with us. And they said they didn't believe it. They ran to the window and they looked out and they saw Jackie Robinson out there. And they said, that's when we decided to march, because Jackie Robinson was here. We knew we couldn't lose. Now, this is the time that Malcolm was calling Jackie Robinson a Tom. He was down there marching on the front lines, with black folk in my hometown. And when I asked them what they thought of Malcolm X, they thought Jackie Robinson, was just short of Jesus Christ and Moses. They thought the world of him. I asked them, and these are people who were on the front line, not people talking trash in Harlem, you understand, or on the south side of Chicago, talking tough. These are the people that was down there facing these murderous rednecks with guns. And I asked them what did they think of Malcolm X. They told me that as far as they could see, that Malcolm X was some crazy nigga in Harlem, some talking crazy who would join some foreign religion and whatnot. They had no regard for Malcolm. They did not regard Malcolm as any serious leader for them. Okay, that's just a fact. Okay, and so when he was calling Jackie Robinson a Tom, Jackie Robinson was a hero to the people who were on the front lines in my hometown. So people don't get it twisted. There's people who refer to Dr. King, as a coward, and they see Malcolm X as this tough guy. Now, like I said, in the 60s, I was a partisan of Malcolm X. I love Malcolm, but in the years since then, when I've had a chance to look at this and study it and read what's going on, there's no question, and for anybody who grew up in the South, which Malcolm did not, and had little experience with the South, there's no question that marching in the face of these armed Southern rednecks, that took more balls, way more balls, than talking tough in New York or Chicago or Detroit surrounded by bodyguards.
Because
that's just a fact.
Yeah, and I know growing up, you used to always say to me, New York people, they think they're so tough. They always came down south thinking they were so tough. But the one thing they don't know was that everybody in the South has a gun. And we all know how to shoot.
Yeah, Rap Brown was talking about that, about how, he came up north and, people talking about what they would do, if they're down there, they had guns. And he say, most of these suckers ain't even got a gun and couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if they had one. He said, I've had guns all my life. We grew up with guns all our life. Everybody in the community. See, what people don't understand is there's a book, another book you all should read, Charlie Cobb's book, title of it is Black Power. Title of it is Nonviolence is going to get you killed. And the subtitle is The Role of Guns in the Southern Movement. Y'all should read that, okay? All of y'all who think that all the black folk in the South were just docile, listen, they were nonviolent during the demonstrations, all right? That was a tactic, you know? Now, Martin Luther King, when Bayard Rustin first met Dr. King in Montgomery, you know, during the Montgomery bus boycott, when King first emerged, you know, in the public eye. Bayard Rustin, who the great organizer, and there's a film on him, a documentary film called The Organizer. You know, if you don't know who Bayard Rustin is, you should know who he is, because he was the principal mastermind in organizing the bus boycott. You know, and he was the principal mastermind in organizing the March on Washington. The reason you don't know about him is because he was gay, and he had been arrested on a moral charge, and so they didn't want him to become an issue, so they kept him under deep cover, you know. But was the mastermind and organized this stuff, right? Now, when Bayard Rustin says when he first went down to Montgomery,
there's a New York City public school named after him. But go ahead.
Yes, well, he lived in New York for many years.
Mm-hmm.
But Oates deals with this in his book. Mm-hmm. When Bayard Rustin first went down to Montgomery to visit King, he said King had guns everywhere. They had guns everywhere. It was Bayard Rustin who taught King into this Gandhian philosophy of passive resistance. They weren't, Martin Luther King in the beginning, they were like black Southerners in general, and he was from Atlanta, you know. And the thing is that we understood that segregation was the law, that these crackers had the law on their side, but there was a point over which they could not cross, and if they did, you know, it was going to be war. You know what I mean? And they knew it. You understand what I'm saying? Most of them knew it. These crackers, they talked tough, but they didn't come. Like, for instance, when in Bogalusa, Louisiana, you know, there was a group that formed called the Deacons for Defense. They just had enough of these crackers, you know, so they formed this group, and these are all church deacons and whatnot, and they were all armed, and they would show up at civil rights movements, civil rights demonstrations to protect the civil rights workers, just like the Not Fucking Around Coalition, this militia that the Grandmaster Jay had formed, which this guy that I think is an agent, who calls himself the black professor that shows up writing this stuff anonymously, you know, online and whatnot, he calls Jam Master Jay an agent. Jam Master Jay an agent. Jam Master Jay is in jail, you know.
Jam Master Jay.
Grandmaster Jay, I'm sorry, Grandmaster Jay.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He's in jail. This guy was a veteran of the military who knew what he was doing and organized this group, the Not Fucking Around Coalition, was a genuine black militia, you know, and they challenged these white militias, you know what I mean? The Yellow Tough coming out, you know, when they marched up on Stone Mountain where the Klan had been born.
Because I know, like, you know, the thing I was saying was that my mom being from Western Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of Klan in that area, but with her it wasn't as bad, because she told me when the newspapers came out and she saw the photos of what was happening in the South, like at the marches and the dogs getting sick on black people, she said she was shocked. They didn't know that it was that bad. So when you say that, you know, Martin Luther King's, you know, nonviolent stuff was a tactic, you know what I'm saying? It actually makes a lot of sense, because in the photos, you have photos of black people being attacked. If we were attacking them, people can make up whatever story they want to make up.
They knew what they were doing. I mean, King, them, these are very smart people, man. And look, they understood, first of all, they understood what Gerald Horne talks about now, that a lot of, you know, the black intelligence and leadership now does not understand the power of international alliances, and Queen Mother got me to see how the Cold War had worked toward getting civil rights laws, you know, getting the United States to back off some of the racial, expose the racial oppression in the United States, which eventually led to civil rights laws. Because here's what happened. Here's what the Cold War was: an ideological war. You know, at the end of the Second World War, the European colonial empires began to collapse. You know, all of a sudden, India, all of a sudden in 1948 became independent of England. This hundreds of millions of people. You know, Ghana in 1957, you know, had became independent. And then it started a whole movement of independence throughout Africa. The British and the French empires would collapse, you know, before the end of the decade. China, you know, had emerged. The Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong and the Red Army, you know, had succeeded in 1948. The French was engaged in, you know, a war, you know, in Indochina, you know, against Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese nationalists, the Viet Minh. And they were communists, you know, but they were also, fundamentally, they were nationalists. Communists had to do with the way they wanted to organize their own society. That was their internal decision. But they were basically nationalists. It was in the sense that their movement was designed to drive the French colonialists out of what they then called French Indochina. In 1954, they reaped a devastating defeat on the French at the Dien Bien Phu, at the Great Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and the French had to flee. That's why in Algeria, in the early 60s, the war in Algeria was so vicious. The French killed 1.5 million Algerians, you know, in a 7-year war, the Great Algerian Revolution, you know, against a French colonial rule, because they were determined that we were defeated in Indochina. We're not going to have another ragtag, you know, colonial group of rebels defeat the French army again, and they did. They fought them 7.5 years. Now, years later, I would become very good friends with one of the Central Committee members of the National Liberation Front, the Algerian FLN, Sharif Galal, who was one of the people that worked with us in forming the first Black Studies department in the world, the W.E.B. Du Bois department at the University of Massachusetts. But they fought a vicious war, and there is a first-hand account of this, you know, what happened in Algeria in the writings of Dr. Frantz Fanon, F-R-A-N-Z-F-A-N-O-N. If you're not familiar with Frantz Fanon, you should read The Wretched of the Earth. You should read Studies in a Dying Colonialism. You should read Essays Toward the African Revolution. I will have more to say about Fanon and his writings and whatnot later, you know, because he played quite an influence on our development as revolutionaries here in the United States. But back to Queen Mother, I want to say this. Aside from her lessons, and I learned about radical politics and learned about the world. She's the one who got me to begin to view things on a global perspective, you know, to be able to see the interconnections with what she called the relationship of forces, you know, began to see this. What people need to understand is this. When people say things like, well, the rappers are, you know, what the counterpart of what we were, the radicals in the 1960s, that's not true. At all. You know, Tupac Shakur was not the counterpart, you know, of Huey P. Newton. You understand what I'm saying? Despite the fact that his mother had been a Black Panther, he was a very disturbed, very lost, you know, a nihilist is what he was. You understand what I'm saying? He was not a revolutionary, he was a nihilist. You know, that is no vision, you know, of a new society we wanted to create. It was just chaos. Like, it was chaos. What is this thug life stuff? You know what I mean? Malcolm X had been a real thug, you know, and he got rid of that. You know, he rejected all of that. And that's necessary. That's a cleansing process that's necessary to become a revolutionary. But all of us were serious students, okay? We read very widely, you know. We read, when I went to the University of Massachusetts, you know, in 1969, I was shocked that everybody there had not read the 3 volumes of Mao Zedong's own Protracted Warfare, that they hadn't read Mao's own Practice, or Own Contradiction, that they hadn't read Stalin's On the National Question, that they hadn't read Lenin's State and Revolution. You know, I mean, I had read all of this stuff. Aside from the scholarly history texts, I had read all of this stuff. All of us did. Look at what happened to the radical leaders, the leaders of the most radical sections of the movement at the end of the 60s, all right? Muhammad Ahmed, whom I'm going to mention and talk about in a moment, Max Stanford, you know, who founded, you know, the Revolutionary Action Movement. You know, we were right there together, you know, founding the Revolutionary Action Movement. Huey P. Newton, You know, Bobby Seals, who were the first leaders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland. Dr. Malala Karenga, who was the head of us, you know, and created the Kwanzaa holiday.
So it's about to end. We're going to restart the video.